Francis, Peter, welcome. Thank you for giving up time in a very busy day, in a very busy week. We've all just been listening to Boris Johnson's first statement in the House of Commons as Prime Minister. So I thought I'd start by asking you what on earth that told us about what we're in for. Francis.
We are in a long election campaign. It was absolutely obvious that was the statement of a man who expects, in fact, wants to go to the country within, I would say, 3 or 4 months. So it was promissory. As far as the immediate future goes, I think we learnt that he is determined not to be a demandeur, and it was essentially the message to Brussels was, when you've sobered up, chaps, we're ready to talk to you. You come to us. We won't come to you. Plus some chunky sounding rhetoric on the backstop.
We'll explore all of that in a second. Peter, what did you hear in it? What do you think Europe heard in it?
So, what Europe heard was the answer to the question they've been asking themselves quietly for the last few weeks, is that what strategic choice is Boris Johnson going to make? Is he rip it up and start again, or does he want surgical changes to the backstop? And they got an answer to that question, and a much less equivocal answer than I think many people were expecting. Actually, not in Brussels, but elsewhere. You remember all that talk about he would go round sounding out the capitals, trips to Berlin, trips to Paris, and there have been overtures, diplomatic overtures. None of that. He said, he used the word abolish the backstop, not time limits, not unilateral exit clauses, abolish. And he said he would talk about doing the backstop as part of the trade negotiation, but he would only talk on that basis, was the direct quote. So absolutely, it was you come to us. There was not going to be any solicitation. And of course, Europe aren't going to come to them, and we're just going to wait and watch and see how the temperature rises.
What a topical day to raise that.
Yeah. We'll wait and see how the temperature rises, and then see who blinks first. I agree, absolutely. We're going to go to a general election. I think the real question is whether or not you go to a general election via a no deal, or whether or not when the actual modalities of a no deal become apparent. And remember, Michael Gove, who really does, I think, understand what no deal means, is in charge of no deal planning. Team Johnson is willing and able to be forced into seeking an extension to hold a general election, because if not, then you need to move pretty quickly to have a general election before October the 31st.
Well, it's very quickly, isn't it, Francis? You've looked at the dates.
We think it's September the 3rd, actually.
That's the last date you could press the button.
You need to have the vote of no confidence on September the 3rd. And there were some who thought that you should have laid the motion this week.
So that's the situation if it's being forced on you. If Boris Johnson was trying to call an election himself, within the confines of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, just as Theresa May did, he could do it just slightly later, but it's still got to be September. Discuss.
Maybe. I mean, so one underexplored issue is what happens to the October the 31st deadline in an election campaign itself. Could we just literally crash out because we're in the kind of regulated period for an election campaign?
And Boris Johnson, as Prime Minister, might not have asked for an extension, and it might not even have been offered.
There you are. I mean, there's your...
It's not unthinkable, but your expectation, Peter, is that if we were, say, in September to have started a general election process, Europe would be keen for an extension. It would be on offer.
Yes, I think it's pretty clear, even from the French, that if there's a large political event at stake, the EU are not going to say no. The EU don't want a no deal here. The question is whether Boris Johnson wants to fight a khaki election off the back of a no deal, or whether when it becomes apparent what's going to be required in a no deal, when you don't have a majority to put in place the no deal legislation. This is not a no deal with mattresses at the bottom of the cliff. This is an absolute faceplant no deal. You couldn't do it any harder, right? In Northern Ireland, there are 8 pieces of legislation and several hundred statutory instruments that have not been laid, and he doesn't have a majority to get them through. So any of the mitigatory measures that you need on trade, on immigration, on financial services, on Northern Ireland will not be in place unless something dramatic happens. And I think that will have to colour his thinking in the end. And if not, then no deal will be very, very messy.
Is there a chance, you think, Francis, that he's going to press this button willfully as part of a plan? I mean, if he's got a plan, why not? The plan should include when and how he presses the button.
Which button?
For the general election.
I don't quite know the modalities, but all I know is that he's going to run as hard as he can towards the cliff in the expectation that he is prevented from going over the cliff. And everything is essentially establishing the pretext for that election, and it'll be a tell him again election. It'll be democracy on trial. You saw all the kind of attack messages previewed by Nigel Farage. He saw how effective they were. He's going to help himself to a lot of them, and then we get into the psephology of, where does if you reunite the Tory and Brexit Party vote, does that get you a workable majority? What happens to Scotland? What happens to the South West? These are the things that we're going to be writing about over the next, over the summer.
I agree. Yeah.
It does feel as though he's going for as much of the 52% that voted Leave as possible, and kind of damn the rest of you if you didn't.
Yeah,
We don't need you on this train.
So one of the interesting kind of weather vanes is, has there been any contact with Labour MPs? Not as far as I know.
And that tells you?
That tells me that they're not particularly interested in, a parliamentary route out of this.
No, and I have to say from my conversations in and around Whitehall, there has not been a huge amount of evidence of the kind of preparations for the kind of negotiation that would lead to the kind of tweet deal which you would need Labour votes to get over the line. I think they realise that Labour aren't going to bail out Boris Johnson. He's just too divisive for that to happen, I think. And at that point, you do the maths in Westminster and you come up pretty much with a strategy that he's come up with. And, why else do you hire Dominic Cummings? Tell them again. And all those talk at the steps of Downing Street, people need to remember, or politicians need to remember, that we work for the people. It'll be the people, me backing the people against the establishment and Westminster. Tell them again.
Will it work?
Unless you really do hoover up a hell of a lot of Labour votes unless you can kind of capture some of the Mansfields and those sort of communities. And I was struck by the left behind towns rhetoric. This sort of Lisa Nandy kind of, Corbyn's been there too. I mean, he's clearly kind of go full bore on that. And the other thing we discovered, you and I, in the huddle afterwards, is that at the moment there are no fiscal rules of the government. They're all under review. So, there are clearly limits to how much cash he can splash, but my God, he's going to write some very chunky checks, which are post-dated until after a Commons majority, to be paid, following a Conservative majority. So the bribe will be sizable.
And that might work, might it? I mean, look at it from the other end of the telescope. What kind of shape are the pro-Remain forces on the other side going to be in? You were watching Jeremy Corbyn trying out a bit of, tiptoeing towards a bit of pro-Remain rhetoric, nervously saying, in those circumstances...
Terribly convincing, wasn't it? Goodness me.
Maybe not his most convincing outing, but nonetheless, Boris Johnson ridiculed him for it. Those forces could be in disarray, couldn't they?
That looks like the gamble to me. And can you split the Remain vote between the Libs, the Greens, the SNP, Labour? What's the message? Yeah, I mean, absolutely.
You could imagine the Libs, the Greens and Plaid sorting something out, as they have shown they're capable of doing in the by-election next week. But Labour, the SNP?
It's not even so much kind of electoral pacts, it's just the clarity of the message or what they're trying to do.
And the consistency, I suppose. Yeah. Jeremy Corbyn, even if he were to try to switch, is going to struggle to convince some people who've gone a bit sour on him because they don't feel he's stridently pro-Remain.
I mean, in a sense, I'd expect Johnson to try to get as close as he can to Swinson. There'll be there will be kind of efforts to love bomb the Lib Dem vote somehow. Don't know how. But then allow her to do the dirty work with Corbyn, which she does quite, as we've seen, she's done quite effectively.
Has Europe given up on? We were talking there about pro-Remain forces. Is that a misnomer? The Remain game is over. Has Europe actually started moving on?
Yeah, I mean, as a Europe editor, I defer absolutely to political editors on whether it can work. I think Europe, I think think Europe realises that the UK has got itself into a place where it really doesn't know its own mind, and it is often not making fact-based decisions on its own future. And that scares Europe, actually. Europe doesn't want a big strategic rupture with the UK. It doesn't want the UK rather to go the full Trump, as one diplomat put it to me, because that worries them. Because actually, as it stands, Theresa May, for all of her impotence in Parliament and her failure to get the deal over the line, which frustrated the EU on so many basic levels, she was on their side, on Iran, on climate change. I mean, some of the things that'd be worth looking at is where Boris goes on the Iran file. Macron making overtures on Iran in his statement with von der Leyen earlier this week. Which camp does Boris put himself in, given our differences over the JCPOA, the joint agreement on Iran? Trade is another one. You know, if Boris talking about going off to do trade deals, you can't do a trade deal with the rest of the world really until you've got one with the EU, with your largest trading partner, because no one will do it. I mean, look at Canada. The UK-Canada rollover, it didn't happen because the minute we advertised we weren't going to charge any tariffs, the Canadians were like, well, why should we do a preferential deal with you? We won't bother. And, you know, so I think the Europeans genuinely look with trepidation. That doesn't mean they're going to cave. It's not in their interests to cave on the issue of the withdrawal agreement. And I think they think that the biggest risk in some ways is more stasis. We have a general election. We don't, as you were sketching out, end up with clarity. And we end up in another phase of negotiations with still no clarity and still no way of moving the ball forward, because the Europeans, I think, will never want to actually kick us out.
Francis, you're nodding and smiling. I thought smiling hysterically.
Because
is that what
surely
you think?
That's right. I just think that we may well be delivered another sort of insoluble parliamentary arithmetic, question. Interesting, I think, straw in the wind. Why spend your summer looking at a confidence and supply 2 with the DUP when you don't necessarily think that you are going to be in government for that much longer, unless you anticipating the high likelihood that you may need them again?
The other side.
Exactly.
So just before we leave all of that, and something you were touching on there, Peter, the percentage chances of a deal along the lines of the one that Boris Johnson talks about, how low?
Negative 100. I don't, they're not going to bin the backstop. I do think there was, I've written consistently that if you could reach a point where Boris could show a majority in Parliament for May's deal with a time limit or a exit clause of some description for the backstop, that would have put the Irish in a very difficult position, because you'd be choosing between no deal and a border, because Europe are very clear that if Ireland wants to retain its place in the single market, they will have to erect a trade border in Northern Ireland, and Leo Varadkar's never really honest about what that means. We're talking about scanning barcodes at the border, checks, etc., to maintain the integrity of the market quite soon after no deal. If you could have forced that reality, a very hard choice between no deal and a time-limited backstop that essentially kicks the can and lets you find an all-Ireland solution of some description to the border question, I don't see why Europe moves. And Europe looks across the Channel or the Irish Sea, and it sees Boris unable, I think, probably to force no deal through Parliament. The fact he's talking about proroguing Parliament speaks to the fact that he accepts that it would be very hard to get no deal democratically through Parliament. And so until such time as that choice really sharply comes into focus, the EU don't move. Why would they?
Francis, where in this election that we're going into, how much could the Conservative Party be changing forever? It's not just you don't sort of suddenly ping back to the Cameron project or something like that. No. Well, Nick Bowles said in tweets last night, in order to try to outdo Nigel Farage, you've become Nigel Farage.
Yeah.
How do you see all that?
It was said to me, what you have to understand about the people in number 10 is that they are Brexiteers first and Conservatives second. And there are certainly a number of people of whom I would certainly think that's true.
Dominic Cummings never joined the Conservative Party, did he?
I don't know why you should think of that name first, but I'm not sure Dominic would be my idea of a Tory.
I don't think he's ever called himself that, yeah.
No. Now, is there this split has been coming for decades, and it's upon us, right? What happens to that wing of the Conservative Party is a very interesting question.
I tried it on a few people today, Tory MPs who might be considered part of that wing of the party, and it was very interesting. Their first answer, all of them, their reflex was, "Oh, retirement."
Yeah.
It wasn't fight back. It wasn't, "Oh, the ice shelves are breaking up, let's join a new force in the middle." It was just
walk away
with
a sigh. Go to the cricket, perhaps.
As Theresa May is doing as we speak, and David Gauke and others.
And Greg Clark, Gavin Barwell. Sit it out.
They'll all be sitting in white floppy hats and a MCC tie.
With a regretful mien.
When Europe looks across, do they think that probably is where we end up now? A no deal of the most brutal kind? That is their central expectation now.
I think more a general election.
And then things are open at the end of that.
Well, who knows where we end up with a general election? You might end up with a SNP, Labour, Liberal Democrat coalition in a customs union, and you're having a very different conversation. I don't think that Europe will do anything too hasty. I think Europe is perfectly aware, that we, by an accident of our history and the politics of the historical politics of the Conservative Party, we chose to funnel the same populism you see all over Europe. You see traditional parties dying all over Europe, whether it's the Parti Socialiste in France, the SDP in Germany, the Partido Popular in Spain, all over France, all over Europe. Those parties are shifting and changing. We happen to have funneled those tectonic shifts via Brexit.
It's our genius of our parliamentary system.
Which unfortunately is insoluble, right? I mean, the accident of history, which leaves a border in Northern Ireland, means that it is extremely difficult to find a way to deliver a meaningful Brexit. That phrase that Brexit's always binary, a meaningful Brexit that retains the United Kingdom as the United Kingdom. Could you imagine a world, potentially, where Boris Johnson does get some kind of majority, he's not reliant on the DUP, and then you create some space in which you find a solution for Ireland that is, as reading between the line of Shankar Singham, the trade specialist and the Alternative Arrangements Commission, that is an all-Ireland solution. If you've got the parties back up in Northern Ireland, you've got Stormont up and running again, could you get to a place where actually that the Larne and Warren Point, where the live animal checks already take place, you can start to build in over time more of the kind of checks that would allow you to retain an invisible border in Ireland, which what everyone says is integral to the Good Friday Agreement and was based on membership, unconsciously, of the single market and the customs union. The customs park at Newry, that by the way was bombed by the IRA, set back several miles from the border, it closed after 1992, when the Single European Act was passed, not 1998, not when the watchtowers came down. And so, you hear people like Paul Bew and David Trimble saying, well, it's a bit of a trade border. You now start to hear that from Boris Johnson, where we don't want to, the guarantee we gave in December 2017, no infrastructure-related checks and controls, is sort of being diluted. I just think the Irish and the border communities will not wear sucking up a trade border, customs forms, frictions, costs, businesses going out of business in order to deliver an English Brexit. Ancient reflexes are being triggered in Ireland, and the only solution, and you can see it just in the runes of what the Alternative Arrangements Commission is saying, is some kind of all-Ireland solution that is got away from this whole toxic question about the union.
What the unionists, though, would say was them being thrown under a bus.
Yes, and that's why in this context it can't happen, because the DUP are in coalition or in conference to supply with the Tory party, and there's so much light shone on it. But if you could get into an iterative talks process where it was about policy, not about politics, could you massage that solution?
But all of that, listening to you there, just makes me feel that at the back of your mind you've got a notion that it's not impossible we could be trying to come out on no deal, and actually that doesn't quite work, and we're still in the European Union this autumn, this winter, and the negotiations somehow resume and we start exploring things like that over time. But I mean, at the back of it, what's the percentage chance in the back of your mind that we are still in the European Union, say, well into next year, end of next year?
Well, that's why I think that the answer to that question is, to what extent is Boris Johnson, given everything that he said, when confronted with the reality of no deal, direct rule in Northern Ireland, Michael Gove raised that prospect to the House already, to what extent is Boris Johnson prepared to be forced into accepting an extension for a general election? If he is, to avoid fighting an election in the midst of real chaos, because I was saying, there are no mattresses at the bottom of the cliff. If he is, then I think it is highly possible, depending on the result of the election, that the boil is lanced, as it were, and either a Boris Johnson government has more space to do actual deals, or a Labour, SNP, Liberal Democrat takes a softer approach. The question is whether or not Boris brings the guillotine down and fights the election after a no deal, and whether or not, when sat in number 10 with the intelligence assessments and all of the detail about no deal on his desk, he's still prepared to pull the trigger. Because, it is wildly underappreciated how messy no deal will be.
One cabinet minister who'd had a one-to-one with Boris Johnson recently, I asked them, will it be any different for him when he sits there and they put the papers in front of him and they all say, don't do this for this reason, this reason, this reason. And this cabinet minister started doing an impersonation of Boris saying, oh, come on, Mark, to the cabinet secretary. I know you just need to believe in yourself. You're a very bright man. You're very, very, very brainy. That brain's going to do it. That brain's going to get through all that. And then he'd up and walk out the room and leave the guy to ponder how to do it. It doesn't sound like he is the sort of guy who's going to be affected by what the civil servants pile up in front of him, is he? He seems to have made his choice.
It seems that way to me.
But this is Boris Johnson, so can we be sure?
So I don't rule out that there is a twin track approach, that you in running as hard for that cliff, you're doing two things. One, you are establishing your election campaign and you're defeating the Brexit party, but you're also exerting leverage for a deal. And I think he wouldn't have necessarily picked Frost.
This is David Frost, his former advisor.
You would not have kept Geoffrey Cox in that position unless you were interested, at least open to, the best possible offer at the last possible moment.
I guess, that some of the European reading is that Frost is just there as the fig leaf, right? Appoint David Frost, special advisor in the Foreign Office, honest guy, then you can say, look, we were fair and all the rest of it. I ask the question again, if the starting point of your negotiation is abolish the backstop, and you come to us when you're ready to talk about doing the backstop in a trade negotiation, when you have no coherent idea about how technology delivers the border, I don't see how both sides have to cave in, as it were, to get to the table. On the question of whether Boris blinks, I raised the point that William Hague made in an article in the Telegraph last week, which is that Boris, in a no deal, has no majority. So if you trigger a no deal, he still needs to get lots of legislation through to do basic stuff. So he goes into the brave new world of no deal and he wants to operate it and manage it and mitigate it and set off on our buccaneering course to Singapore. He's powerless. There's no legal basis to do a whole load of really basic things. And at that level, I guess he can tell the civil servants, you just shuffle off and find a way to do it. But at the same time, he's going to have to own the paralysis.
How far behind does Europe think Britain is on its no deal preparations?
Miles.
Kilometres.
Kilometres. Sorry, yes. I think if you look at what the French have done in Calais, they built a lorry park. The number plate recognition software is all up there. If you look at what's done at Rotterdam and Antwerp, the problem you have now is just a bottleneck constraint. So if you're going to go into a no deal, and legally the EU is charging tariffs on everything, which it will be, and 6,000 to 10,000 lorries a day go over the Dover crossing, if you talk to the big logistics company, they will say, in that world, Gibbons Transport drives its truck across the channel. Now, if you've got lots of infrastructure, you're a big company, you have your EORI customs number, right? You will know which 6-digit WTO tariff codes apply to everything on your rig, right? And you will have the paperwork all pre-farmed and pre-farmed, and you will go over the Channel Tunnel, and your number plate will be red, and it will go, Gibbons Transport, very good. Yes, half the traffic that goes through that tunnel is small traffic. And if you talk to the Road Haulage Association, they are not ready. The small business has not prepared. So then it's a bit like doing your tax return. If you're a small business, let's say doing a US tax return without an accountant, if you don't know your way round, you're stuck. You need a customs clearance agent who tells you, what you've got on your rig is this. This is how you're going to fill out the paperwork. This is the numbers you need. This is the certificates you need. Oh, you've got animal product there. You need and it's got, beef in it, or it's got hormone in it. So what you need is a 106201/4B. Fill out that, right? It's not something that Blogs Transport can do. So where are you going to get the customs trainers for? We'll be ready, says Boris. The ports will be ready. No, they won't. You can't. It's not like training up a bunch of security guards for Glastonbury. It's reasonably technical, right? You need to train those guys up. So I'd open a cafe on Manston Airfield if I was you.
There's a thought for a nice, hot, sunny day. Just to end, Francis, we were touching on the Vote Leave team, the band back together again. Some of what we saw with the announcements yesterday of jobs was the original plan that Dominic Cummings was sitting there with.
And the Australian points style and the
2016.
Yes.
And Michael Gove was going to be sort of chief exec, project chasing on Brexit, while Boris Johnson was the chairman.
Seizing the birthright that was dashed from them. I mean, that is.
But the difference is they're now got 98, 97 days.
Which is kind of perfect, which is roughly the kind of campaign period, I mean, they don't have to worry about this stuff, right? That's
after the election, you mean?
That's kind of details. Boris Johnson only makes sense as a sort of campaigner, right?
But an election only makes sense before you've had, if Peter's right about the no mattress fall off the cliff, that election's got to happen before you're anywhere.
Unless you're doing an extension, because if you're doing it on a no deal, you have no legal basis for your grand immigration policy. On what legal basis do you have the right to set your immigration policy? The immigration bill's not gone through.
But what kind of shape is your party in if you've had a cliff edge fall afterwards?
See, I don't think the strategy is to go over the cliff at all. I mean, I think the really smart thing for Europe to do would be to, and in fact for everyone to do, is just to say, fine, off you go. Parliament shouldn't try to stop it, it's a hell of a gamble. My guess is that he would actually stop at the edge of the cliff rather than jump. But
that's the question.
It's like Nixon's dangerous madman. Is he prepared to do it or is he not?
His first statement, reminiscent of Theresa May actually, get out there, make a bunch of big promises, over-promise some things which aren't particularly well thought out, and then realise you're stuck and go for a general election. History repeats itself. The question is whether or not that general election happens before which side of a no deal. If you're right and Boris brinks, he allows Parliament to force him to request an extension. Then he can go and tell them again, evil Parliament, evil establishment, they stopped me, I worked so hard to get a no deal, I tried, but our hands are tied. And then he doesn't have to face the consequences of no deal, but can still go to the country and say, give me a mandate and I'll take us out.
I think that is his preferred route, but I think there's a sort of 25% chance that he thinks that they will blink.
The Europeans will blink. Bonne chance.
Bonne chance.
Bonne chance and...
To the ball. Bonne chance.
And merci. You very kindly to give up your time on a busy day. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Francis.